Well, hi, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to our second edition of Breaking News for this Wednesday. It's the 26th day of March, 2025. And as always, some stories have come across the wire since we last met earlier this morning that have something to do with what the Bible says will take place in our world before the second coming of Jesus Christ and the many events that they predict, that is, the writers of Scripture predict will precede it. So let's look at the headlines. First one, all proposals failed. This is Egypt. They blame Donald Trump for breakdown in the Gaza ceasefire talks. You ever notice how no one ever blames Hamas for anything? It's just Donald Trump or the Israelis. All right, Hamas has threatened the hostages are going to return in coffins if the fighting keeps going on in Gaza. In other words, with all the shooting, all the bombing there, most of the hostages will probably end up dying. We'll talk about that. That's their latest thing they've tried to do to get the fighting to stop. Gazans for a second day now. This is interesting. Protest against Hamas rule over the Strip. Second consecutive day they've done this, and the crowds are getting bigger. We'll see what happens. And we'll mention again that the Hamas cannot come out and thwart these types of gatherings because they're open targets. If the Israelis, they're flying over and their helicopters, they've got drones and that, they see some Hamas terrorists there, they'll gun them down. So interesting. So we'll see what happens on that. It's real interesting. Interesting story, speaking of interesting, from Gatestone, no difference between Hamas politicians and terrorists. This is where they take apart Steve Witkoff, the envoy of Donald Trump, and show what we've been saying here. It's a similar article, what we've been talking about, his just lack of ability to really even understand what's going on there. Senate from the Federalist now. This is humorous title. Senate Dems claim censorship industrial complex never happened. Never happened. But if it did, it was a good thing. That's from the Federalist, and it's an interesting story about continuing issues we've seen about Britain, UK, we've seen about the European Union yesterday, and now today, censorship with respect to the United States. All leftist regimes, and this is what happens when you get something like that. And now, the last headline, number 6. This is from the UK Daily Mail. Secret CIA files claim the Ark of the Covenant has been found. Okay, it's not true, actually. When you read this story, it's not true. We'll get into it. The Ark of the Covenant has not been found, but it's interesting you get that headline. I'm sure some of you might have come across it, so I wanted to deal with it. And so we'll deal with that too. All right, let's look at the headlines. Number 1, all proposals failed. Egypt blames Trump for breakdown in Gaza ceasefire talks. Egyptian sources say Israel is using negotiations as a cover to advance plan for the forced displacement of the enclave residents. They're attempting to undermine Egypt's mediation efforts in a hostage deal and ceasefire negotiations with Hamas. This is from a newspaper in Qatar, which reported last night, citing tonight, citing Egyptian sources. The London-based Daily El Arabi El Jadid cited sources as saying that Israel is using the talks as cover to advance a plan for the forced displacement of Palestinians from Gaza. There are attempts to embarrass Cairo through an Israeli plan aimed at advancing the forced displacement agenda, one of the sources said. The report also said all proposals presented by Egypt in recent days have failed. Well, we know that, largely due to a lack of support from Washington. No, largely due from a lack of support with Hamas. The U.S. administration, they say, has refused to provide any guarantees about applying pressure on the Israeli prime minister. One source proposal, which called for a humanitarian pause during an upcoming Muslim holiday of Eid al-Fitr, was reported rejected by the American envoy. The negotiations have been stalled since the conclusion of the first stage of the hostage deal nearly a month ago. In the absence of progress, fighting between Israel and Hamas, of course, has resumed. U.S. officials believe military action is justified due to Hamas's refusal to make concessions, but are urging Israel to limit its operations. Reports that all proposals presented by Egypt in recent days have failed, again, largely due to support from Washington. So Washington is being blamed. They're blaming the fact that they want to get all the Palestinians out of Gaza, so they're just dragging this on, so there'll be nothing left to do. Because Gaza, if you've been looking at any of the recent photos, that was bad enough before, but more and more buildings destroyed. It's really a mess. And like was said, it would take 10 to 15 years probably to rebuild it again. And you can't have 2 million people there while you're in the process of rebuilding. Anyway, Bottom line is nobody knows how long this fiasco will go on until there is some resolution. And the only resolution is the destruction of Hamas's military capabilities and the removal of all Hamas leaders from Gaza one way or another, and an Israeli occupancy of Gaza for some period of time. If not, expect another October 7th massacre. It's going to happen over and over again. And Israel knows this, and so this has to be dealt with once and for all. Now, Hamas is trying everything to get Israel to capitulate, but it's to no avail. This includes the recent psychological warfare video of the two hostages. They showed them for the first time they're alive after 500 and some odd days, and they begged to be released, as of course they would in a video like this. And, they look terrible. And it's sad. And because of the warfare, it puts on the hostage families, on the families of the hostages. And so we have this threat again from them based on that. Headline number 2, Hamas threatens hostages will return in coffins. Meanwhile, Hamas threatened that the hostages would return in coffins should Israel continue airstrikes and ground operations in the Strip. Every time the occupation attempts to retrieve its captives by force, it ends up bringing them back in coffins, it said in a statement. The group claimed that they are doing everything possible to keep the occupation's captives alive, but the random Zionist bombardment is endangering their lives. Now, this is supposed to get Israel to stop the bombing, as well as eventually being an excuse, of course, when a number of the hostages eventually will be found dead. They'll say, well, it's all the Israelis' fault. It's the Israeli bombardment that did this, when we've already learned in many cases just out and out murder by these Hamas terrorists. All right, now here's a great headline. Number 3, Gazans protest against Hamas over rule of the Strip for a second consecutive day. Anti-war protests flare up again in Gaza as Hamas blames Israeli mouthpieces. Demonstrations erupt in Shijaya and Beth Lahia, with more expected across the enclave. Fatah voices support as Netanyahu says Gazans turning against Hamas. Protests vindicate that they're turning against Hamas. Rare public protests against Hamas have resumed on Wednesday afternoon in Beth Lahia and Shijaya, neighborhood of Gaza City, a day after hundreds of displaced residents in northern Gaza demonstrated against the war and their forced displacement. Now, again, this is in 2 different places now, so it's spreading out. The word is spreading of this, that they will protest. Protesters chanted slogans including "Out with Hamas," as frustration over the ongoing war and deteriorating humanitarian conditions spilled into the streets. Well, we'll see where this goes. 2 straight days of protest. Like we said, Hamas leaders can't show their heads publicly for fear of being eliminated by the IDF. If they, see them anywhere on the street, they have to go back underground, seeing that the fighting's resumed. Now we have another story on censorship. This seems to be a popular headline in the last couple of days. This is story headline number 4 here, and it goes like this. This is from the Federalist. Senate Democrats claim censorship industrial complex never happened, and if it did, it was a good thing. At a Senate judiciary hearing, Democrats can't help but admit they support government censorship of free speech. Democrats had a tough time at the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee hearing yesterday on the censorship industrial complex. They had to argue that there was never any censorship during the Biden administration, including during COVID, and that free speech and the freedom of the press were never threatened by the partnership of government agencies with private institutions to combat quote-unquote disinformation. After all, the government was just trying to catch foreign disinformation operations, they argued. So any censorship that did happen was necessary and proper. This is actually what they said yesterday. Now, of course, nobody believes this. As it has now come to light, censorship is acknowledged to have been everywhere during the COVID crisis until the end of the Biden administration. As we talked about yesterday with the UK and the European Union, both places making it clear that censorship is necessary so that the public will only get the right information from the online websites. And of course, the right information is from these leftist leaders in both the UK, the EU, and of course the Biden administration. The information they need to get is the information that comes from us. I mean, it's laughable when they said there was no censorship during COVID. It's If you recall back in 2020 when the story first broke about COVID, what we've done from the beginning, the Chinese Communist Party coronavirus, that it was obvious that we were told that it came naturally from a wet market in Wuhan, China, that it was not a result of any lab leak or anything like that, or any purposeful leak of some type of bioweapon, but it was just one of these things that came from nature and it just happened to fall into one city in the world, Wuhan, China, which had the number one uh, laboratory in the world holding, deadly pathogens such as SARS virus, we can go through the list, bird flu, you name it. They got everything there in their lab and had the most destructive, deadly viruses in the entire world. But coincidentally, the virus just happened to break out in that same city, quite apart from the lab being there, which the same lab, when it was in Beijing, had a leak about 2 decades ago. But anyway, be that as it may, if you try to say anything different in 2020, you were looked at like you're some scientific nincompoop. You've got, you wear the tinfoil hat, this and that. We got intel right away, right in the beginning of 2020, that it was purposely leaked. It wasn't leaked. Well, it was purposely taken from the lab in Wuhan. That's where it came from. But it was leaked purposely. It didn't escape by accident. It was purposely leaked as a bioweapon. And this was, paid for by Iran, North Korea, and for China to do this. And a part of it was to go after Israel and go after other parts of the world. And we had that confirmed. For a couple of years, we couldn't say anything about it because, the censorship would be shut down. At least now you can talk about these sorts of things. So still the story is, well, they said it's not a virus that came naturally. It came from the lab, but it was a leak from the lab. It wasn't deliberately released. Yes, it was deliberately released. The evidence is there. But anyway, we got that going on. So it's not surprising that the leftist government, the U.S., would censor things. The depth of censorship is coming to light in the last number of years with what the Trump administration is doing. And it's certainly not pretty. And to make matters worse, some 63,000 pages of files, 2,200 files about the Kennedy assassination have finally been released some 62 years after the fact. And there's still confusion and redaction about what actually did happen. And probably we will never, never, ever, ever know. And so if you live through that time, the frustration, the heartache, and the absolute shock. There is nothing probably in my life, any headline, anything that has shocked me more, except 9/11, than the assassination of President Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963. I was in junior high at the time and playing flag football. We did it early in the morning. First period was PE. And our teacher, Mr. Selvin, came out and said the President of the United States has just been assassinated. And believe me, that it's hard to explain what those days were like. It's hard to explain even thinking about it again. And of course, we saw the assassination. That was, I was in junior high then, my senior year of high school, in order Martin Luther King, was it March of that year? Then in June, right when we were about to graduate, Robert Kennedy. And I remember we almost had to do a self-counseling there, one of our classes the next day after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated here in LA. And talking about this is the world we're all just going out. We're just graduating from high school, and this is the world we're going to face. And most of us weren't Christians then at the time. We didn't know what we're going to do. Unfortunately, the Lord found a lot of us there. But confusion, censorship, we still haven't got this straight stuff on that. All right, another headline: no difference between Hamas politicians and terrorists. This is from Gatestone. The Hamas, needs to demilitarize, and they might be politically involved in Gaza. And this is what Witkoff said to Tucker Carlson on March 21st. They need to demilitarize, but they could be politically involved in Gaza. Now, this article just shredded Witkoff a lot more than I did. When they quote him, I thought we had an acceptable deal. I even thought we had an approval from Hamas. Maybe that's just me getting duped. About his extension that he thought had just finished negotiating that they were going to go for. And the article says, duped is putting it mildly. Witkoff, who doubtless has the best intentions, is sadly proving to be the perfect mark. The article goes on to talk about his talk about a possible political role for Hamas is dangerous, mainly because it implies that the U.S. continues to view the terror group as a legitimate player in the Middle East and the Palestinian arena. If the U.S. envoy wants to see stability and security in the Middle East, he must insist on the complete and permanent removal of Hamas, all of its wings. There's no difference between the political wing and the military wing. Destroying much of Hamas's military capabilities or disarming it is totally worthless. They must be removed. It's a great article, and that's from Gatestone. And finally, from headline 6, secret CIA files claims of the Ark of the Covenant has been found. All right, get this one. The location of a chest believed to contain the Ten Commandments. Well, it did contain the Ten Commandments. Has long been a mystery. Yes, 2,600 years it's been since the last Herod, 2 Chronicles 35:3. But CIA documents claim the Ark of the Covenant has been found. Well, not really when you read the story. A lot of mistakes in the article. According to the Bible, the Ark of the Covenant was built by the Israelites shortly after they fled Egypt around the 13th century BC, as the 14th century, actually. Moses then placed the Ten Commandments inside. Second set of the Ten Commandments. The first he broke. Remember, he threw down from Mount Sinai. Well, here's the story. The CIA conducted experiments in the 1980s with individuals who claimed they could perceive information about distant objects or other people. And so they were to locate a target that was described, the Ark of the Covenant, hiding in the Middle East, that they weren't told what it is. Now, these people were called remote viewers, and we were made known about them actually it was in the 1980s, actually, when we did our first trip to Israel to look for the Ark of the Covenant, look for the exact location of the temple. We have a whole set on that in our book, Jews, Jerusalem, and the Coming Temple. We have that in our one of our appendices where we talk about the trip there. Well, we didn't find anything. We were stopped from doing it. But the point is, the scientists from SRI International, we went up and visited them before. They were the group that had the equipment, and they brought someone, or they talked about someone who was a remote viewer, and that's where I found out about this. But anyway, the remote viewer basically has it that they can see things at a distance, see things remotely, and supposedly they told him to look for this, and he continued. A coffin-shaped object is what it was. The target is a container. That's all they said. Target is a container. It has another container inside of it, and the target is fashioned of wood, gold, and silver. And the remote viewer continued to say that the coffin-shaped object is located somewhere in the Middle East and saw people around speaking Arabic. Well, that's real helpful. The remote viewer, however, was not told they were searching for the long-lost Ark of the Covenant, so they think he actually saw it, that he knows it exists there somewhere in the Middle East, and that's certainly a big help, isn't it? And that was it. So the headline that has been found, no, it hasn't been found. We have a whole book on the subject, In Search of the Lost Ark, The Quest for the Ark of the Covenant, where the last half of the book looks at the possible places the ark could rest. It was lost. Again, Second Chronicles 36 is 36, or I keep 36 through, I think it is, not 35 3, 36 3, where it was King Josiah told the priest to put the ark back into the temple. And this was before the Babylonian captivity, took all the implements from the temple and hadn't been heard from since. If it does exist, which I really think it does, I believe very strongly, it's under the Temple Mount, buried there somewhere in Jerusalem, awaiting to be found in the last days. I think there's a number of reasons for that. We talk about that in the book if you're interested in seeing that. All right, a lot of things going on, never a dull moment. The beat goes on, as it were. We see story after story after story that sets the stage totally for what the Bible says, where these players will be lined up at the end of the age before the second coming of Christ. It is amazing. So again, stay tuned. Much more to happen. So Hamas, again, threatening the death of the hostages. Egypt saying it's all the U.S.'s fault and Israel's fault that we don't have any agreement yet. And the censorship keeps going on. I'm Don Stewart. Thanks for watching. Until next time, may the Lord richly, richly bless.